One of the verses that we were exposed to repeatedly when we became world missionaries was Timothy 2, verses 1 and 2. You'd hear it frequently in the orientation sessions. You'd hear it frequently from veteran missionaries. It says, "Thou therefore, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus, and the things that you have heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men who shall be able to teach others also." And they would point out that there are 4 links to this chain. The things you have heard of me, so the first link was Paul. And the second link was Timothy, who heard from Paul. And the third link was faithful men that he would find who could be able to teach others also, which would be the 4th link. And that's how the gospel is transmitted. The emphasis being faithful men, and the emphasis being on the training of leaders. That was part of the bedrock DNA of Assemblies of God missions from the very beginning. And this was at the very beginning of the explosion of Assemblies of God missions around the world. In order to keep our focus, we had to recognize that as missionaries, once the church is established, once that initial evangelistic phase happens, then the task of missionaries is to raise up leaders. Not long ago, I was in a service where this verse was read, and it was read like this: "The things that you have heard of me, the same commit to faithful men who shall be able to teach others also." And there were 3 little dots, meaning there's a word or phrase left out. Why are we leaving those 3 dots out? They are the phrase, "among many witnesses." So I got to thinking, who are the witnesses that Paul was talking about? The things you have heard of me among many witnesses. And I thought about the people that were present when Paul carried on his ministry. And many of them are named. And of course, in every city there were people that we'll never know till we get to heaven. But, Paul and Barnabas had this big split. So Barnabas takes John Mark and Paul takes Silas. And it's Paul and Silas, and it's Paul and Silas, and it's Paul and Silas. You know that Lystra, Derbe somewhere, Timothy comes onto the scene. He's an adult, probably non-practicing Jew. He hasn't been circumcised. His father was a Greek. But he comes to Christ. He's circumcised because they always start the ministry in a synagogue, and he wants Timothy to be able to be participatory in that. They're traveling, and Timothy is not mentioned for a long time. Silas is mentioned. And then it says that Silas and Timothy are sent by Paul somewhere else. And it's Silas and Timothy, and Silas and Timothy. And then it says Timothy and Erastus are sent somewhere else. Now Timothy is the lead guy. You see an evolution. Those words, "among many faithful witnesses," deal with a very strategic concept in communication. Most people, when they start out teaching, teach a truth. Then after a while, they realize, I'm teaching a truth to people. But then finally, hopefully, they come to the place where they're teaching people the truth. And the difference is dramatic, because the center of the process is now the hearer, not the speaker. And that's what postmodernism is, and it's what the rest of the world has been doing forever. We just kind of got away from it for 500 years. And that is, the context dictates the process. What does that mean? Well, it means that the witnesses are the heart of what's going on. And Paul's ministry is feeding into them, but the things that happen to them are as much a part of the process as what Paul says. How did Timothy learn to do what Paul did? Not just by listening to him talk in a classroom. He was living the life. They were going into cities. In fact, right after Timothy joined the team, they didn't know what to do. Luke says that they tried to go into Bithynia and the Spirit wouldn't let them, and then they tried to go somewhere else and the doors were closed, and then they went to Troas and they didn't have a clue what to do next, and Paul has this vision about a man in Macedonia, and they decided, God must be leading us to Macedonia, and Timothy is watching all this. They are part of the context, and so are the listeners in every city. The people in the synagogue, how they're reacting. It's all part of that context. And they're all learning, what do you do in these situations? Well, truth is, Paul didn't know what to do. He had to wait for God to help him know what to do. All of them were watching those lessons. This is not classroom stuff only. They certainly heard him teach. And finally then Timothy's on his own. You never know in that process who will emerge as a leader. You cannot predict it. So you can't put all your eggs in one basket and say, this is the project, or this is the leader. You never know who the real leader is going to be. Timothy was one of the least likely. He didn't have all the synagogue training. He didn't know all the traditions. He didn't know all the Hebrew. That's what the process does. And when we think we can pick these people out, we sometimes eliminate the most promising people. Right. It's about the process, and when it's about the process, that is about the people. So I pray that God will help each of us to get enmeshed in life and do the part God calls us to do, and know that we can't do the other things. But somewhere out there are leaders, and there's sometimes the people you'd never pick, but they're there. If we help them through their struggles, however we can, God takes care of the rest. But when we elevate stars and say, we're going to put all our eggs in your basket, that, even if they're that good, that's too much pressure. Some of these future stars, when they call you, might not act like one. You know? And they've had a bad day, and they're about to make sure somebody else shares their life with them, you know? Why can't you have a bad day with me? I'll feel better. But in the midst of all of that, I think one of the things that joins a young church with an old church is the young church is still living in the fire of its initial launch, and the old one went through so much fire that they had to go back to their roots and start over. And suddenly, they're very much alike. And God gets our attention when we're under tension. So whatever tension you might be under today, may God give you the grace to see His hand in it and to lead you through it, knowing that the Christian life is about life, not about performance. All of us knock against each other, positively or otherwise. That's where the real growth happens.